So welcome to part 2 of the screencast on professionalism and the GPhC. So at the end of the first part, I asked you just to have a quick think about some attributes that you might expect of somebody who was a professional, like a pharmacist. So hopefully you've come up with a few things. I've got some examples that I came up with, so I'll just go through some of those. So even things as basic as being punctual can affect how people perceive you. So if you're often turning up late to work, then that can have an adverse impact on how people perceive you. It's really important in a pharmacist, particularly if you're somebody, if you're the only pharmacist in a particular store, then actually if you're not there, then the store can't open. So you might sort of think, oh, well, I'm only a few minutes late, but actually you could have patients there waiting to get their medicines. So punctuality is really important, and it's something that we're quite keen on when we see when students are coming into their sessions, so don't be late. People will expect a pharmacist to be well dressed. So again, when you start your dispensing classes next term, we'll be expecting business dress. So it's all part of being a professional. We expect people to be polite and respectful. So that might be, even if you might have different opinions compared with somebody else, and that might be in discussions in class, or it might be out when you're out in the workplace. But it's really important that you're respectful to other people. It's obviously important that you're honest, because you're going to be looking after medicines that can cause harm if they're not used in the right way or if they're misused. So being honest in the way that you're working is very important, particularly if you find that you make a mistake, being honest about that as well. Being empathetic, so trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So you'll come across patients who are going through some difficult times in life, and it's important that you're able to be empathetic with them and try to understand what they're going through. It's important that you're reliable. That kind of links in with the punctuality. You should always be aiming for high standards. So as a pharmacist, you need to always be doing the best that you can possibly do. As soon as you start to lower your standards, then you start to put patients' health at risk and safety at risk. You should be ethical in the way that you work, and you'll learn more about ethics as you go through this year and obviously later through your program. But really, it's kind of dealing with things that aren't black and white. We're trying to often deal with complex situations where there isn't a clear right or a wrong way, or there might be times where there's something that's in the best interest of the patient but is actually not in line with what the law might say. So you're trying to balance all those different things, and that's something that you'll learn about as you go through the program. Kind of linking in with that a little bit is being accountable. So being accountable and responsible. So when you make a decision, when you take an action, you're taking responsibility, you're being accountable for your actions. Confidentiality is really important. So you will know things about patients that other people don't know, that they might not, and the patient may not want other people to know. So you have to be really mindful of confidentiality all the time. You may also know things about a patient that they don't themselves know. So, for example, you may know of a particular diagnosis that has been made and they haven't yet been told. So you have to be really careful with the information that you're party to. Being sensitive, that kind of links back in with the empathy, being empathetic. So thinking about what your patient is experiencing. Being non-judgmental, so you may not agree with a particular person or patient's way of life, but you need to be non-judgmental in your approach. And finally, being a team player. So sometimes you can see pharmacists out in the workplace who think that they're better than other people and maybe better than other members of the pharmacy team, but actually the way that the pharmacy works best is if everybody plays to their strengths and makes the best of each other. So it's really important that you're a team player, and you'll do lots of group work as you go through your M-Pharm to help you to develop these skills, but this will be really important to you later in life. So those are just a few things that I came up with, and you may well have come up with some other ones, but there are lots of different attributes that people will expect to see in a pharmacist, and you need to be trying to maintain those at all times, and we would expect you as pharmacy students to be maintaining that professional attitude at all times as well. I should add that this isn't just when you're at work, this is also when you're out and about as well. So when you're out socializing and things, all the standards for pharmacy professionals, all those expectations, they apply at all times. So we've thought about who is a professional. So again, thinking back to our dictionary definition, so a professional is a person who's engaged or qualified in a profession. And we've already defined what a profession is. So then if we think more specifically about pharmacy and pharmacy professionalism, so pharmacy professionalism, again, looking in the MEP, so the Medicines Ethics and Practice Guide by the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, is a set of values, behaviours and relationships that underpin the trust that the public has in pharmacists. So some of these examples, they link in with the stuff that I've just been talking about. So appropriate accountability, having compassion for other people, always looking to provide excellent services, always be trying to improve yourself and the services that you deliver, having honour and integrity in the way that you work, maintaining professional judgment, respecting other patients, but also the people that you work with, so whether that's pharmacy colleagues or other healthcare professionals, and working in partnership with them, so all of the people that you might come in contact with, so your patient, any doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, etc. You might come into contact with a whole range of healthcare practitioners, and you should be able to work effectively with them to sort of promote the public and the patient's best interests. So if you don't do that, so if we're not following those attributes of a professional, then we may be considered not to be fit to practice. So we'll just look a little bit at that at the moment, and hopefully again you'll have already heard this term in some of the Welcome Week talks. So when are we fit to practice? So we're considered to be fit to practice when we are able to demonstrate that we have the right skills, we have the right knowledge, the right character, and also that our health is good enough that we can work safely and effectively. So we can do a good job and we can work in a safe way. From a GPhC point of view, fitness to practice represents our suitability to be on the register without having any restrictions to our practice, so to the way that we work. So when we join the pharmacy register as a pharmacist, we have to complete a fitness to practice declaration, and this is done every year. And as part of this, we have to sign, or basically declare that we would let the GPhC know if there's anything that we are aware of that might make us unable to work in a safe way effectively. So if our fitness to practice might be impaired. We also, as part of this, have to show that we're completing continuing professional development. So continuously improving ourselves, learning new things as new medicines come out and so on. We have to do that every year, and we have to be able to demonstrate that. So that's part of this revalidation that we have to carry out every year for the GPhC. And you'll learn more about this later in the term, and we'll be getting you to carry out continuing professional development as you go through your degree, so that when you come to be a pharmacist, you're already used to it. So obviously there can be some times when a particular person's fitness to practice is impaired, and that might be through misconduct, it may be through lack of competence, so not having the knowledge or the skills to be able to work in a safe way. It might be through ill health, or it might be through convictions or criminal offences. So if anything happens that might affect our fitness to practice, we have to inform the GPhC within 7 days. So if our status changes, so for example, if we get a conviction or our health changes enough to have an impact on our ability to work safely, we have to tell the GPhC within 7 days. So what happens if a pharmacy professional's fitness to practice is impaired? So the GPhC has a really 4 different things that it can do if they find that a pharmacy professional's fitness to practice is impaired. So the lowest level is just to issue a warning to the pharmacy professional. So this would be a formal warning, and it would obviously be kept on record. The next level up is to impose conditions on that person's practice. So it might be saying you can only undertake certain services, or it might be saying you have to work alongside another pharmacist at all times. They might decide to suspend the person from the register, so that means you wouldn't be able to work as a pharmacist until the end of that suspension period. So that might be if it was something relating to health, for example, and you were suspended from the register to give you time to recover. And then obviously the most severe is removing that person from the register, and that means that they can no longer work as a pharmacist. So that removal from the register, that obviously that's the most serious thing that can happen, and that might be because they think that there's a continued risk to the patient or public. They might think that the person has a lack of insight, so they can't see for themselves why they're not working in a safe way, or whatever the situation is, why that's making them unsafe in their practice. People who are being dishonest, people who've really moved away, they're not meeting the standards for pharmacy professionals, so people who've deviated from those standards. Things around some of the high risk medicines, so particularly controlled drugs. So if a pharmacist was to be found to be supplying controlled drugs, for example, that's obviously going to be very severe. But it can also include things like discrimination. So if you're being discriminatory against somebody else because of their race or whatever, again, that could be considered severe enough to warrant removal from the register. But is everything always clear cut? So let's just have a quick look at an example. This is a non-pharmacy one, just to give you sort of an introduction. So if we think about a person who's found speeding in a residential area and they get caught, they're doing 90 miles an hour and the maximum speed limit is 30. So the person gets stopped by the police, they get pulled over. What do you think should happen? So think to yourself, would you think, okay, that's fine? Would you give them a caution, or would you revoke their license? So if you think about those different levels, that's really the kind of approach that you're thinking about when you're thinking about fitness to practice. However, we then find out that the person who's speeding, their father is in the passenger seat and he's having a heart attack, and the person is trying to get to a hospital. So would that change the outcome? So it's thinking about, you need to know more about the situation. You need to have the evidence of what is going on and try to see things from different sides to work out what is going on with this particular person. So if we think about a real fitness to practice case, so this is from a few years ago now, but it does kind of illustrate the concept quite well. So we'll introduce you to Mr. H, who's a pharmacist, and he was convicted of supplying the morning after pill, so the contraceptive, and he was selling it to a man, and it was somebody that he knew. So he was convicted of doing that. He shouldn't have been doing it. It was without a prescription at the time when contraceptive pills were only available on the prescription. And he said, "I'll never do such a thing again. Until the day I die, I will never forget what I did." So think to yourself, if you were the GPhC, what would you do? Would you give him a reprimand, give him a warning? Would you give him a suspension, or would you strike him off the register? So what the Fitness to Practice Committee actually decided was that they gave him a reprimand. So that might surprise you. You might have expected they would have been a bit harsher in their approach, but their statement was that they felt that they were happy that he wouldn't do this ever again and that he had effectively learnt his lesson. So then 20 years later, we have our pharmacist again. So highlighted in red there, R&C Pharmacy, amoxicillin. So what had happened was Mr. H was on duty in a pharmacy, and a customer came in and asked for a supply of amoxicillin. So the pharmacist just asked 2 questions. He just said, what strength would you like and have you used them before? And unfortunately, it was a BBC researcher who was acting as the customer, and this pharmacist sold them a packet of amoxicillin, again with no prescription, and the pharmacist never asked for a prescription either. They just asked those 2 questions and then sold them the antibiotic. Even more unluckily for Mr. H, the whole situation was filmed by a hidden camera, which was being worn by the undercover researcher. So, does a case exist in relation to Mr. H's fitness to practice? So the things that the GPhC would be thinking about: number 1, does this pharmacist present an actual or potential risk to the patient or public safety? Well, probably yes, because he's selling medicines without a prescription. Does it undermine the confidence in the pharmacy profession, or is it likely to? Well, it obviously came out in the news, so seeing pharmacists selling medicines without prescriptions and so on, then that's going to affect the way that the public might view the profession of pharmacy as a whole. Has there been a serious or a persistent failure to meet the standards for pharmacy professionals? This is obviously the 2nd time that he's been sort of caught out doing things he shouldn't be doing. Does the situation show that the integrity of the registrant can no longer be relied upon? And lastly, is it in the public's interest to refer him? So things that the GPhC would also, the Fitness to Practice Committee would also take into account. So they'll look at the person's behaviour and the way that they've acted, and think about, have they been open and honest when they've been caught? Have they been open with the committee, for example? Were the actions that the pharmacist or pharmacy technician undertook, were they reckless? Had they done things on, had they acted badly on purpose? Was it intentional? Has it been a recurrent issue? Is there any sign that they've learnt or any evidence that they've learnt from the incident? Have any remedial actions been taken? So has anything been done to address the issue? So that might be the person has engaged in some training, if maybe their knowledge or their skills weren't up to scratch, or have they changed their practice? And they'll also look at any other previous investigations or previous advice that's been given, or any previous warnings. So obviously Mr. H had that previous investigation. So if we think back to Mr. H, was his fitness to practice impaired? Well, yes, the GPhC Fitness to Practice Committee decided that it was. So he'd obviously been before the Fitness to Practice Committee before. So here he is again. So what do we think the outcome should be this time round? So again, if you were on the Fitness to Practice Committee, think about what would you do? Would you give a reprimand? Would you suspend him? Or would you strike him off? So the committee's decision was just to suspend him, which surprised me, and I think it usually surprises most people when they hear about the case. You'd expect that he might be struck off. But hopefully this kind of gives some sort of helps you to see that the GPhC aren't there just to strike people off straight away. They really do look at the risk to patients and the wider situation when they're deciding what they're going to do. Just as a kind of aside, there has been a case where the GPhC took itself to court because it was unhappy with the ruling that had been made after the Fitness to Practice Committee had listened to a particular case. So the GPhC took itself to the High Court, and then the case was heard in the High Court, and they overruled the GPhC. So the GPhC had originally not removed this pharmacist from the register. The Fitness to Practice Committee, the wider GPhC, weren't really happy with that, so they went to the High Court, and the High Court judge overruled that and removed the pharmacist from the register. So that was just an unusual case, obviously a few years ago now, but I just thought it was worth you being aware that that could potentially happen. So obviously the external courts could get involved in a fitness to practice case. Okay, so I just wanted to, just to finish off this screencast, just to make you aware of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the dedicated professional body, so the body that represents us as a profession, and they represent pharmacists in England, Wales and Scotland. So they're there to promote the profession, to try to encourage people to use their pharmacist and visit their community pharmacies, for example. They produce practice guidance, so that might be guidance on things to think about when selling a particular over-the-counter medicine, or they've produced guidelines for hospital pharmacy practice, which can be used by chief pharmacists, so the pharmacists in charge of hospital pharmacy departments in designing their services. They can provide support, so they can help with continuing professional development, for example. They provide networking, so they have these local practice forums, which before the lockdown would sometimes organise like little training sessions and talks and things for local pharmacists. And as I mentioned, the Medicines Ethics and Practice Guide, so the RPS is responsible for publishing that. So the Medicines Ethics and Practice Guide is a really useful guide, and you can access that if you joined the RPS. It has lots of information and it's in quite a easy to understand format, so it's useful when you come to having to revise for exams, and particularly when it comes to things like dispensing exams, which you'll have in your third year. So I would really encourage you to sign up to the RPS. You may have had this recommended to you already, but if you haven't, I would really recommend that you do it. There's a document in this lecture folder on Blackboard, which just takes you through the steps of how to do it. It's free for pharmacy students, so you might as well make use of it. And then that gives you access to their all the different resources that they produce. So I'd really recommend that you join the RPS, so that then you can access the AP and the other resources. Okay, so that's brought us to the end of the two screencasts. So just to reflect back over the learning outcomes that we've covered in the talk. So firstly, we've looked at the terms, the sort of definitions of professional, and pharmacy professionalism. We've looked a bit about the attributes and behaviours that are expected of a pharmacist and other healthcare professionals. We've looked at the functions of the GPhC and how it works to make sure that patients and the public are safe. And we've also briefly mentioned the role of the pharmacy professional bodies, so the RPS, which is the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and APT UK, which is the pharmacy technicians version of the RPS, so the Association of Pharmacy Technicians UK, which carries out a similar role to the RPS